And that brings us to this evening. And as today is Marine Protected Areas Day, how do we make them work? Our esteemed guests are Dr. Bruce Mann, Dr. Kendyl Wright, and Kholofelo Ramokone. Now, I'm just going to give a brief bio about each of them. Kholofelo Ramokone, we have a long history now. I think it's over 5 years. So I know very well that Kholofelo is deeply passionate about helping others, and it's a value instilled in her from a young age. She applies this principle both personally and professionally, and having grown up inland in Polokwane, she developed a fondness for collecting water from the river. This early connection influenced her decision to pursue a career involving water and led her to study chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Limpopo, where she earned her undergraduate degree in 2016. During her studies, Kholofelo became captivated with aquaculture and then made the decision to specialize in this area as part of her academic journey. And starting a journey as an intern in conservation scientist with WWF's small-scale fisheries program, she now collaborates with the coastal fishing communities to promote the importance and benefits of conserving marine sources. So if you just wave, Kholofelo, there we have her. We also have Dr. Bruce Mann. Now, Dr. Bruce has been a senior scientist with the Oceanographic Research Institute, ORI, in Durban, who has worked since 1992. He recently retired at the end of February 2023, but has continued his affiliation as a research associate. His work has largely been focused on the wise and sustainable management of our marine lionfish resources, and he has been particularly interested in the role played by marine protected areas in this regard. He has also been involved with the ORI Cooperative Fish Tagging Project since its inception in 1984, and has been responsible for overseeing the project since 2003. Dr. Bruce has an MSc degree in ichthyology and fishery science from Rhodes University, and a PhD degree from UKZN in 2016. He is also a very keen angler and diver who enjoys spending time in the field. So, Dr. Bruce, would you just wave again? Okay, and I'm now going to introduce our first speaker for this evening, who is Dr. Kendyl Wright. Now, Dr. Kendyl is a dedicated marine biologist with a commitment to marine conservation. At present, she holds the position of Marine Protected Area Scientist at Wild Trust, the Wild Oceans Program. She's a passionate advocate for the expansion of marine protection, actively contributing to the discourse on the need of safeguarding the marine environment. Having earned a PhD in benthic ecology, she has diverse experience in both the private and non-governmental organizational sectors. Initially specializing in coastal ecology and nearshore benthic habitat research, she has now transitioned into the realm of MPA, science policy and planning, and is currently engaged in various marine protected areas spanning South Africa and the West Indian Ocean, with her focus to community and small-scale fisheries engagement, reflecting a keen interest in fostering inclusive conservation efforts. With that, I hand over to you, Dr. Kendyl Wright. The floor is now yours.
Oh, nothing makes me cringe like being called Dr. Kendyl. Kendyl, boys. I never feel like I really earned it. Let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. Like Aisha was saying, my name's Kendyl, and I work for the Wild Trust. We're primarily based out of Durban, and we do a lot of work in the east coast of South Africa. Sorry, 2 seconds. So we work on the east coast of South Africa. And I just want to apologize in advance to the people who have already heard about the MPA guide today, but I'm going to be speaking about how we apply the MPA guide to South African MPAs. So I'm sure all of you know, being MPA Day, what a marine protected area is. And I always love looking at this image because you can clearly see how our network of MPAs that really range right around our coastline and far offshore, and have been really well thought out and well placed to protect biodiversity throughout our EEZ. So I really want to start by pointing towards global treaties So South Africa is a signatory of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And most of us know this target as target 330 by 30, but there are many targets within the GBF that talk to protection and expansion and the need for expansion. But the problem with these kinds of targets is that the overall indicators tend to be things like spatial coverage, when in reality, we know spatial coverage doesn't always mean protection. So we then get down to the nitty-gritty of how do we actually understand whether protection of the marine environment is happening by these areas within the ocean. And particularly, how do we look across different countries to see whether we're protecting sufficiently? So just a little bit of background context for anyone that isn't very familiar with MPAs. Our MPA networks, most of them are zoned. So I like to show this image. It's of the southern part of the Isimangaliso Wetland Park. And you can clearly see the various types of zones that we have within our MPAs. So typically we have controlled zones which allow fishing, restricted zones which don't allow fishing, and then sanctuary zones which try to limit all impacts, including sometimes tourism or diving, and try to have areas which are excluded for use. So for example, at the bottom, you can see the lighthouse controlled zone, and this is a very important zone which allows for use of resources, but it's still conserved. So within our MPAs, we don't allow things like mining or oil and gas. But then if you look at the next zone up, we have the railway ledges restricted zone, and that doesn't allow fishing. So it will allow for spillover from these areas into the adjacent zones. And it'll get clearer why I'm trying to explain the zonation as we go through the MPA guide and how we applied it in South Africa. So just another example of that is the Agulhas Bank. So you will see here, for example, the Agulhas Bank complex. We have a controlled zone, which allows fishing. We have a restricted zone, which doesn't allow any kinds of fishing. And then we have the pelagic zone, which allows you to fish for pelagic fish. But obviously, that's all with permit. And it is very well regulated. And then you'll see the Agulhas Mud MPA, that's a sanctuary zone, which means we try and reduce any kind of impact, including any kind of even tourism or going into the area. We try and keep that very much a sanctuary zone. Okay, so what does the MPA guide actually do? Well, as I was saying earlier, that not all MPAs are created equal. And this is within South Africa, between our own MPAs, as well as globally, because of the way we implement and actually zone MPAs with different sets of rules. It means that the outcome of those MPAs can be different. So there was massive motivation and a movement for us to really have a global tool that allowed us to determine whether MPAs are effective on the water and see whether we are seeing biodiversity benefits from these MPAs. And this also allowed us to then compare across regions and say, are our MPAs as good as they can be? And maybe identify areas where we can improve them. So the MPA guide has 4 elements, and I will be speaking primarily about the first 2 here, which is the ones that we assessed for our MPA assessment in South Africa, and they are stage of establishment as well as level of protection. So a stage of establishment ranges from proposed, which is essentially someone has come up with an idea where they've identified areas on a map, primarily through conservation planning, where we put a whole bunch of data together and we've identified areas that we think should be in protection. Designated means that the area then has a gazetted boundary, so a legal boundary of where that MPA is. Implemented means that there is management on the water, and actively management means that we are now seeing monitoring and a feedback loop where we're ensuring that we're actually protecting the MPA. 4 levels of protection, they worked from minimally protected, meaning that the area has high levels of impact, all the way through to highly protected, which means minimal impact, and fully protected means that there's no extractive use on the water. It doesn't mean that there's no tourism or other opportunities, but it means that we're not extracting resources. So how these levels are determined are primarily due to these 7 different activities. And you can see along the top axis, they are typically in MPAs the most impactful activities. And then they obviously correlate with levels of protection. So whether an activity can occur, then you will have a look to see how protected from minimally all the way to fully protected. And interestingly, in South Africa, 3 of these activities typically don't occur at all. We do not allow for mining, dredging, dumping, or aquaculture within our MPAs. So anchoring tends to be minimal, and it tends to be fishing that really determines the level of impact within the MPA. And you'll see now as I go through our assessment. So this graph is just to show you how level of protection and stage of establishment speak to each other. So essentially, MPAs that are actively managed or implemented on the water and fully and highly protected offer the most biodiversity benefits. Whereas an MPA that's just sort of committed or designated maybe have very wishy-washy guidelines for the protection of the area, and we're allowing high levels of extraction and use, they're not going to achieve biodiversity outcome. So we just have to keep this in mind as we go forward. So currently, these are the results for the South African MPAs. We see here, and this is still being refined a little bit, that all South African MPAs are actively managed and implemented. So that is very good. It means that there's some kind of management authority, that most of the MPAs are now starting to have management plans, and it means that people are aware of them. And I will speak to some shortcomings in a little bit, but in the meantime, let's celebrate how well we have done in our MPA network. In terms of level of protection, and this was for me the most interesting part, was that of our 5.4% protection of our EEZ in South Africa, 3% is fully protected, which means it's closed to all fishing and all extractive use, which is actually very, very high in proportion to the area that we protect. We then have a high proportion of highly protected areas, and these areas still allow for small impacts, such as maybe invertebrate harvesting or very low levels of fishing pressure. And these areas still obviously provide very important biodiversity benefits. In terms of lightly protected, most of these areas occur along our coastline and a couple of them offshore, and these are primarily due to fishing impacts. But then we also have to be aware that some areas within our MPA network are always going to be utilized. So we just have to be aware that, you know, these numbers are important for us to understand and to contextualize how much protection we're doing, and to look forward and say how much we want to protect, either in these fully and highly protected areas, but then also just to be aware that sometimes MPAs are zoned in a way for use, and they're never going to achieve a highly and fully protected status. And that's also okay, because and someone corrected me on this recently when I was traveling in Chile, that we have to remember that we're part of the environment. So even though we see ourselves as separate and we are just managing the environment, that's not true. We've been interacting with the environment and being part of the environment for a very long time. So this just shows exactly what I've shown you on the previous graph, but in a map form. And you can see the same coloration, and I zoomed in on the 2 MPAs that we showed in the beginning with the zonation, the Isimangaliso and the Agulhas Mud and Bank Complex. And the reason I was showing you the zonation is you can see the areas where they omit fishing are fully protected in Isimangaliso. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor there. We're in the top right-hand corner. But the other areas where it allows pelagic fishing, so a fish that would maybe move out the area, these areas remain hardy. And you can't see it very clearly on this map, but the areas along the coastal zone where we're taking out resident bottom fish, these areas will only be designated as likely. In the bottom, you can clearly see again for the Agulhas Mud and Bank Complex, the areas that are have no fishing are fully protected. Areas with industrial fishing are lightly protected, and then areas which allow for pelagic fishing but don't impact the benthos, those areas are still highly protected because we acknowledge that they're catching fish and species that move through the area but are not interacting with the benthos. So what does that mean for South Africa? How do we compare globally? And I was actually quickly adding this graph a little bit earlier because I thought it was quite nice to contextualize how well South Africa has done in terms of percent. So all of our MPAs are fully and are implemented, sorry, excuse my language, or actively managed, which is actually very impressive when you start comparing to even the northern countries like France and Canada. Almost 70% of our MPAs are fully and highly protected. This means that they're accruing biodiversity benefits and really benefiting everyone in terms of spillover. Excuse me. And if you look at the other countries, you'll see how low their percentages are, meaning that their MPAs and the MPAs that they've got in place because of the regulations don't actually offer the protection that they set out to do. And they really need to go back and to assess their MPA, not necessarily the networks, but the rules around their networks. My favorite example is Canada. Canada achieved 30 by 30 already, pretty much. They have large areas of OECMs and MPAs. However, many of these areas do not have good regulations around fishing and oil and gas, and they are really vulnerable to impact. So these areas shouldn't be counting towards our targets, and they should be really reassessing how they're implementing their MPAs. Okay, so I'm just going back to our title of how do we make MPAs work? I think looking at the MPA guide and obviously trying to look objectively at our South Africa MPA network, we have to acknowledge the limitations of the guide. So while our MPA network is very positive, and we have areas that are very positive in terms of conservation and biodiversity benefits, we have to see these findings in reality, and that there are many budget and capacity constraints. And I think most MPA managers can talk to this, that either they don't have the budget to really monitor the area or manage the area, but then they also, there's large areas that are subject to poaching. So we have to be very aware that while we're doing well, we also have these limitations that we really need to try and work on. I would then following on from that, I would say we need to work with what we have. Currently, the MPA network is founded in very good science. South Africa has a very good history of systematic conservation planning. The little map that I have on the bottom corner there is our critical biodiversity areas map, which is led by Sanby. And that identifies areas according to many data layers to identify for protection and expansion eventually when we start expanding our MPA network. We have an advanced MSP process, which is actually out for comments at the moment, and then which will really benefit identifying these areas for protection. And then we also are starting to talk about OECMs. So OECMs in South Africa are likely to be primarily coastally based, and it's going to hopefully serve a small-scale fishing communities by securing fishing rights to areas outside of MPAs, but still trying to accrue biodiversity benefits. Oh, sorry about that. And then lastly, I would say when it comes to how do we make them work, we need to have difficult conversations. The reality is that we can't, as a person that works in biodiversity and conservation, I cannot sit behind my computer and not engage with people that work either in fisheries or in mining and oil and gas, and really understand all the different points of views that should be included in the marine space. So the marine space is very complex, and I'm not saying that we're always going to agree on the best way forward, but without having these very difficult conversations with stakeholders, we're definitely not going to move forward. So I think that's where I would like to end. It's just to encourage everyone that is in different sectors and in different areas and has different expertise to come to the table to talk about protection, as well as sustainable use and how we can move forward with really expanding our MPA network so that we can ensure that it really serves the people of South Africa by preserving fish stocks and preserving important areas for biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kendyl. That was very informative. And I looked at that graph and I thought, if this was an Olympic sport, then I think South Africa would definitely get the gold in this one.
I think
So
so
thank
too.
you. So somebody, like you said, somebody that is very hands-on and has a practical application in MPAs is Kholo. And Kholo, are you there?
Yep.
All right. So you have worked with communities in the Betty's Bay area for many years. And in your experience, what are the most important things that you have found to contribute to improve relationships between MPAs and communities?
Yeah. So hi everyone. Just listening to Kendyl and the talk, I totally agree with what she just said. So we need to have difficult conversations. So it's not even everything that she mentioned, but then it also includes how do we communicate with the communities that are around the MPAs and benefiting from those MPAs. So it's gonna sound very cliche, and I always say this. It's literally what makes any other relationship works. So you need to build a relationship by looking at the trust that you build with the community. So this goes both ways. The community needs to trust the management of the MPA, and the management needs to trust that the community are also in it to be part of it, and they really want to be part of it. So that trust needs to be there, which means we also need to look at respecting each other, and we also need to look at transparency. So it shouldn't be a matter of the management coming back to the community with a decision, but then a conversation that is transparent, and it goes both ways, that this is the decision we want to take. How does it impact your livelihood? And then the community say, okay, but then how can we make sure that we also contribute to the biodiversity protection and again, livelihoods. So those are the three things that I mostly think contribute to the best relationship. And then after that, in my opinion, we can start talking about awareness and education and community involvement. And this can be by them monitoring the coast and monitoring the biodiversity, being part of research, looking at citizen science research. Yeah, and then we look at co-management. But then we really need to start off by building the relationship, and part of the hard conversations or the difficult conversation looks at those MPAs and if they're doing the work, and if they actually benefiting the coastal communities. So that's what we're trying to do at Betty's Bay with Cape Nature, and it's not an easy one, but we have few successful stories.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Kholo. I appreciate your idea of mutual respect and that you build it on that. I just want to ask Dr. Bruce. So many people have found it difficult to understand how you can tell if an MPA is working. In your experience, having studied the impact of MPAs on fish populations, do you have any examples that prove that MPAs do benefit fish and fishers?
Thanks very much, Aisha. Yes, I've been one of those very lucky people who've spent most of my career working in MPAs. And a lot of the work that I've done has been trying to quantify or kind of look at how MPAs work at protecting marine biodiversity and in particular in fish. So I started in 1989 in Tsitsikamma, spent 3 years there, and then moved to Ori and Durban, and I started a project in the Ismangaliso MPA in 2001, worked there for 20 years, and then started a project in the Ponderland MPA in 2006, and worked there for 15 years. So I've had a number of projects running, long-term projects where we've been trying to look at the effectiveness of our MPAs. And yeah, I think firstly, it's without doubt. I mean, there's no doubt about, if you give nature a chance, if you give her a chance, she will respond. And we see that in all ecosystems on the planet, that if you give her a chance. So what first happens is when you protect an area, and normally this would be you'd stop the fishing. So here we're talking about Kendyl's either highly protected or the next order up, what was that? Fully protected areas. Those two would be the areas that I'm talking about. You see a rapid recovery in the number of fish. So if you compare with a fished area that's adjacent to your protected area, so you're comparing the same type of habitat, you're looking at the same reefs, the same structure, the same depths, everything is the same, but one is protected from fishing and the other is not. You see very quickly the number of fish coming back in the area that's not fished. I mean, it makes sense. It's just you're not removing them from the water anymore. Over time, if you protect it for long enough, you see those fish starting to grow and they get bigger and bigger. So you get more biomass or weight of fish in your protected area. And this is particularly true for resident species. So not so much the ones that are migrating or moving through, but the resident reef fish become bigger. And that's kind of quite incredible, because once you start protecting those bigger, older fish, they are able to contribute orders of magnitude more eggs and larvae. And there's a lovely acronym that we call BOF hypothesis, the big old fat fecund female fish. So if you protect those big female fish, those females can produce orders of magnitude more eggs. Their eggs are more viable, and they have a better chance of being fertilized and surviving, and becoming little fish larvae. And yeah, those fish are also genetically fitter, because that big old female has survived. She's lived through predation, she's lived through disease, so the genes that she's passing on to her progeny are fitter and stronger than those of fish spawning in fished areas outside. And a lot of work that's been done in Tsitsikamma more recently by Rhodes University has been showing that the fish are physiologically fitter, which is like incredible. But the fish in the no-take MPAs are more able to withstand things like temperature change, and they're competing with each other more in the no-take area because there's more fish. So they're actually fitter, and they're better equipped to kind of adapt to changes in climate. And that's incredible for us, because that means by having these no-take MPAs, they are areas that are resilient to what's coming, with changes in climate, changes in water temperature, etc. So that is really, really important. So we've got more fish, we've got bigger fish, and we've got healthier fish. And then I think one of the best things for me, as a fisherman, and I love fishing, and I fished since I was 4 years old. But what we're starting to see is, if you protect these areas for long enough, you start to see what's called spillover. You start to get the fish building up in numbers until they compete with each other for resources, for food, and they can't find enough space in the MPA. Remember, there are no fences around a marine protected area. It's an area designated on a map, but people are not allowed to fish in there. You find that fish start to move out. So the adults and juvenile fish start to move out and find areas to live in outside the MPA, and that's what fishermen can harvest, and they can benefit from that. So in addition to those adults and juveniles moving out, you also have what we call seeding of the eggs and larvae of the fish that are spawning in the MPA, drifting out in the current, and then settling down on reefs outside the MPA. So by having a network of marine protected areas along the coastline, you can really effectively use MPAs as a fisheries management tool to manage our fisheries, and the communities and the fishermen that harvest the fish can directly benefit from that spillover. So they're incredibly important. We really need them. But as Kendyl pointed out in her talk, there are a few buts that we have to understand. And a couple of authors, the first author was Edgar in 2014, coined a term which are called the Neoli principles. Neoli stands firstly for N for no take. So the ones that really work, protected areas that really work, you don't allow harvesting. And this is from a biodiversity or a fisheries management point of view. Secondly, they've got to be well enforced. People have got to respect those MPAs and not go and poach or not go and fish in them. Otherwise, you're gonna fish out, all the recovery that's happening in your MPA. Third one is O for old. So the older your MPA is, the better it is, because it gets back to what we sort of regard as a pristine or an undisturbed type condition. And what we've seen in some of our older MPAs, such as Tsitsikamma and Ponderlanders getting there now, that have been protected for long periods of time, is that the fish communities change completely in the no-take area. They're starting to get back to what they originally looked like before we started fishing them. And they're dominated by lots of large predators. Whereas in the fished area, those are the first fish that are taken out. So you get a whole kind of change in the community structure. And then the last one is L for large. So generally with marine protected area, the kind of rule of thumb is the bigger, the better. So we've done a lot of work on the size of MPAs and how big they need to be. And certainly there is a place for small, kind of well-spaced protected areas. But if you can protect a bigger area that's got more diverse habitats, more species, that's going to be more effective in the long run. So those are some of the buts that you need to understand when you are designing and implementing and managing marine protected areas, is that these are the things that really make them work. But I'm talking here from an ecological biodiversity point of view. I'm not touching on what Kola was talking about in terms of the communities and making these areas work and getting people to buy in to their importance, which is a massive challenge globally, not only in South Africa. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. But before I ask the questions, because there are a few questions I see in the chat, I just want to know if you would like to elaborate, this is to you, Dr. Bruce, on the kingklip, because that's a very successful case in point. So the kingklip spawning box is located, I think it's the Port Elizabeth Coral Reefs. It's right next to that MPA. And I know in 2017, SASSI still designated it in the red. But in the past few years, it went to the orange designation for longline fishery. And it's currently in the green for longline fishery, making it sustainable if that's how it's fished. And that is because that spawning box is the space where the fish or the big old fat female. Am I saying? Okay, that is where that fish goes annually to spawn, and it becomes a no-take area for a few months. And I think that just shows the value of a fish that was overexploited 3 decades ago to now being sustainable.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, it's important to understand that marine protected areas are not the only tool. And when we're managing fish stocks, particularly commercial fish stocks like kingklip, there are a whole suite of other factors that come into managing that fish stock. So we limit the number of vessels that are allowed to fish for them. We limit the type of gear that they're allowed to use. We set annual total allowable catch levels that they're allowed to catch, etc. So there are a whole lot of other traditional fisheries methods that we use to manage kingklip, and those have been successful. But I think the realization and the recognition of that area of PE where the kingklip aggregate to spawn every year is absolutely, by protecting that area, you're protecting the golden goose, because that's where the fish are aggregating, and the fishermen used to harvest them on that spot. And the decimation that you cause when you fish a spawning aggregation is huge, because you're pulling all the fish into a small area. So you kind of really pulling the plug out by fishing them on those spawning grounds. So if you can identify important spawning aggregation areas that happen predictably in time and in space, on certain reefs or in certain areas, and every year that the fish aggregate there, if you can include those in part of your marine protected area design, it's going to be that much more effective. So that's what we try to do when we kind of look for areas that are requiring protection.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Bruce. I need to open the floor now. And the first question that I have is from Sandra Hardy. And she asked this questions while you were speaking, Kendyl. So I'm not sure if it's directed at you, but it's open to all three of our speakers tonight. And our question is, how is it that our Minister, Mantashe, is persistent in his proposal to mine offshore off the coast of Cape St. Francis? Is anyone willing to answer?
I mean, I can have a go, but I'm sure Bruce, with his experience, and Colin might have some better input. I think we have to. The problem with the Department of Minerals is their mandate is to exploit minerals, and then when they are allowed to make the decision about whether mining should or shouldn't go ahead, there's obviously going to be conflict with the environment. So essentially, it's within government, they need to be clear that whose mandate it is to make the decision about whether mining should or shouldn't go ahead. So we have to be quite pragmatic sometimes as ecologists, because the ecologist in me wants to protect everything. But the reality is that we use resources, and I drive a car and I have batteries and I eat fish. And so we have to be very aware that it's a multi-use space. But when the Department of Minerals is both the promoter of mining as well as the decider whether mining should go ahead in many environments, that's a significant concern. That decision around environmental impact and harm should really go through the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to really assess the impact fairly, and then make the decision about whether that is a suitable area to mine from the impact that we're going to see happening. So that's my opinion on that. I'm sure someone else wants to have a go.
No, happy with that. Well done, Kendyl. I wasn't going to tackle it.
Yeah. Thank you, Kendyl. There's just a few other comments, like Bruce, it seems that working in MPAs clearly keeps you young. And that is from Johan Kruger. There's another comment from Peter Turner who says MPAs are dead.
If I look at myself in this video screen here, I don't look very young anymore. So.
That's perspective from our side. Peter Turner says that MPAs are definitely working. As a fisherman, we are catching better fish on fishing grounds. So that's straight from the fisherman. And he agrees with you. I am going to... Please do.
Can I add to that? So Kolo mentioned the importance of monitoring and kind of involving community members. And what I tried to do in both of my projects in Ponderland and Ismangaliso was to try and bring fishermen with me so that they could really experience what it's like fishing in these no-take areas. And yeah, it is really a case of seeing is believing. You know, you can show people graphs, you can tell them, you can, you know, show them movies, but it's nothing like actually seeing what it's like, either getting underwater and seeing the fish or actually fishing them. And in this case, we were releasing all the fish. We were using barbless hooks. But it's amazing how by talking to fishermen and explaining and showing them how these MPAs work, that kind of understanding has spread. And I've subsequently completely independently listened to fishermen up and down the coast talking about how they are seeing more and more Scotsmen in their catches. They're seeing more black mussel cracker. Down here in the Eastern Cape, where I've moved to, 74 is so wild off East London. You know, the fishermen are complaining that they can't catch anything else. So there is absolutely no doubt that, you know, even some of these really slow growing resident reef fish, if you give them enough time and you protect them and enforce it properly, they will recover and they're coming back. So it's really makes my heart warm to hear fishermen talking about this and acknowledging the fact that these areas work, because that means we've got hope in doing what we're doing. It's not all uphill. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Can I add to that, Aisha? So when Bruce was talking, I was actually, when he was talking about this spillover effect, I was thinking of the project that we implemented with the small-scale fishes, similar to what he's talking about right now. So in 2019, when I joined WWF, there was this project. It was a continuation from a pilot. Most of you guys, almost scientists will know BRAVS, like the baited remote underwater video system that they do research with, and they go out and so scientists come in, they do research, they give data to DFFE, and then the fishers are complaining like, hey, people do this and this is our cause, so we want to be part of it. So we implemented this project that was literally putting fishermen and scientists in one boat. So we have them and then trained the fishers, also get their knowledge, because they have their knowledge, they know their coast, they know what they've seen the changes. It might have been the difference in the language that they use, different from the scientific knowledge language. But then, so they did the research, and it has been going on for years now. There is already papers that were published, scientific papers that were published, and this was data that was collected by the small-scale fishers, the Kochopek small-scale fishers. And even now, so from 2019 until now, we continued with this project where it got to a point where we didn't need a fisherman on the boat. We didn't need a scientist on the boat. So you have small-scale fishers using their own boats. They have a rig, they have the camera, they go out, they know how to deploy, they know how to carefully take it out. And then we have the youngsters from the area that are trained to actually analyze the data. And then you submit it to the scientists to actually verify the data. And right now we're working on developing few papers from those, that information, looking at the difference between the inside of the MPA and outside of the MPA. But then that's the scientific part of it. With the community, what's interesting is then you get to see the change in the way they talk about their coastal, the confidence in them being part of meetings, because now they're able to talk to Dr. Bruce and say, when I do my research, this is what I found. It's no longer about what you're telling me, but then this is what I've seen. But then they're also doing a research, and they understand that it's scientifically proven, and they understand the methodology, so they're able to tell you what they've seen in their own water. So when they're talking about, oh, we haven't seen snook, they also tell you about what they've seen in those videos, and what the data has been telling them. So yeah, and it's great that there are papers that are being produced and people can actually see that the community is being involved. So that's another way of making sure that if we want these MPAs to work, we have to make sure that, yes, we can do research, but then how do we make sure that the communities are part of that, so that when we want to protect, it's not a matter of you get out because we're protecting biodiversity or we're protecting fish, but then we're also saying we also understand people need to eat. So how do we make sure you do research and you gain from that? When we have funding, you get paid from it, or you monitor your own coast, and then all those things. So it can be, there's a point where it can be balanced and it can work. And you'll be shocked because then it's easy for coastal communities to protect it because they stay there. Unlike us when we go home to our own rooms outside, far away, but then they stay there. So it means more to them when they're part of this protection. And then that's how then it's easier to be more successful with these MPAs. But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kholo, and thank you for sharing that with us. It is very heartwarming. There are 2 hands up. So before I go to the questions that is in the chat, and there's quite a few in the chat now, I'm going to ask Enrico to please unmute and ask the question. And if anyone else wants to ask a question, please share in the chat or lift your hand, your virtual hand up.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks everyone. Really important talk happening here. I really enjoyed listening the both sides of the story from Bruce, from an ecological point of view, the importance, and from Kholofelo, the community importance, the human side of the importance of the MPAs. So I really believe that it's such an important tool. So I'm a bit worried when I see, you know, statement that South Africa is doing so well, etc., and is doing so well, in particular on paper. But I really think the things to move forward would be also to evaluate how, not just how we increase the amount of MPAs, but how we are using those MPAs. Desktop studies, great, South Africa top notch, and compared to Canada and everything, but in practice, the story can be quite different. And therefore, for example, evaluating the monitoring and the enforcement of the MPAs is something that is not what is happening on paper, is not what's happening in reality. And that is a big issue happening in many MPAs where, yes, they are protected against fisheries, but that doesn't happen in practice. And on top of that is also how the MPAs were set up. As Kendyl said, they were set up for different reasons. How are we doing in aiming for those targets? How far an MPA, how well is doing in reaching the original objectives that were used to design that MPAs? So that monitoring of the progress is very important, not just to have a line on a map and say, oh, this is protected offshore, but there's no way to check offshore whether there is really protection or enforcement, etc. So we need to be practical in South Africa and really try to focus on what we can achieve, how we can achieve, and be realistic. This is what we aimed, and this is where we are. We still need a little bit more, but we need to be candid about this. Not always, we're doing so well. We can say that we can do better, and that's very important to say to the public as well, that there is room for improvement, and we need to focus that. Even before going too much further, 30 by 30, it's only 6 years away, and you know, that extra 20%, it's tough. But can we do it? Let's work on what we have and what we're doing. The great stories that Bruce said about the recovery of the fish are very important, but we need to focus on doing little steps, not running too much. Otherwise, we're gonna fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. Do any of our speakers want to elaborate on that?
I'm happy to start because he referred to the work that I was presenting. Enrico, 100%, and that's exactly why I was saying we need to make sure that our findings are seated in reality. So the reality is there are problems in South Africa and there are problems with our network. And any MPA manager will turn around and say to you, we don't have enough money for these parks. Many of the 2019 Pakita MPAs that were implemented were given to management authorities without any additional budget. I mean, these are significant concerns. Of course they are. However, for us, and I can only really talk working as an NGO because that's where I come from, when we work within MPAs, it's much easier for us to work with an MPA that is already designated and on the water. So we can go to an MPA management authority and say to you, how can we help you? And in KZN, for us, that really looks like we have management effectiveness projects that are very large Blue Action Fund projects, which get money from overseas philanthropic sources to make sure that these MPAs are then implemented. It's very difficult for us to get that money if that MPA isn't already in the water. So the funding streams around protection are very well gate kept, if that's the right word, going forward. So 100% agree with you. It's pointless running ahead, but all of the MPAs that we designate now exclude oil, gas, mining, bottom trawling, regardless of what kind of rule or whether they're implemented or anything like that. And it's very easy for me as a desktop warrior to sit and actually monitor the seismic vessels offshore and make sure that they don't go within that MPA. So yes, they're not perfect. We would 100% support anyone in that kind of a conversation, but we also have to be aware that the ocean is changing very, very fast. We have many people competing for this space, and us as typically preaching to the converted in this room, need to stake out our space around protection with a voice that actually says, actually, this is enough now. We need to protect. We know we need to achieve these areas. We're not going to be perfect. And we need to try and push that conversation and not let people the mineral, a DMR or minerals or whatever, turn around and say to us, actually, you can't expand past 5% or 10%. We know we need to protect more. And that's the reality. So it's just, we are walking a tightrope here, and 100% take your point. But yeah, trying to find that balance is always a challenge, but we're game for it.
Thank you, Kendyl. Enrico, do you want to add to that?
No, that's perfect. I fully agree, and I think we don't need necessarily more, but we need better. I think that's really important, in particular in coastal South Africa. That is where we can control. Offshore is very difficult, and that is good. We can remove mining and other areas from offshore. In particular, inshore, we need to do better, not necessarily more. In particular, because we're going to impact other stakeholders, etc. We need to be careful of that. So really, it's about the better, not necessarily the more. And we don't want to go into a tick boxes exercising. Oh, we created this other one. We want to do better and get better out of what we have achieved. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Enrico. So quality over quantity is what he's referring to. I'm going to ask Pete Oxford to unmute first. And Peter Turner, I'm going to ask you next because I see you've left quite a few questions and discussions in the chat. So first Pete Oxford and then Peter Turner.
Yeah, hi everyone. Quick background. I'm a marine zoologist living permanently in Betty's Bay, right on the coast. I look at it every day and visit it every day. And it's not in a good state. I'm sorry to say that, Kolo. I know that you're trying, but basically, I've gone through a lot of historic photographs and what have you, and it used to be much better. I've gone through all the BRUV stuff that Mike Markovina started with, which now gone onto the small-scale fisheries. and looked at all those, and there's a serious decline in the basically the old fat fecund females, particularly the resident large species there. And there is not much commercial fishing per se. There's obviously heavy abalone poaching, but there's a definite need in my mind to protect it, to put it as a fully protected status. It's tiny. And back to your reference, Bruce, of the older the better. This is the oldest MPA in South Africa, and it's also the smallest, and we still can't protect it. There's no protection going on. There's really nothing. I mean, anyway, it's allowed. It's apparently you can buy a permit at the post office and go and catch fish. But the fishermen, the line fishermen from shore, what they want to do, the fish that they want to catch are specifically those old fat fecund females. That's what they're after. They're after the biggest fish they can catch, but we've got to save something. We can't trash it all equally. If we can save this handkerchief-sized MPA with a completely no-take zone, it will have the spillover effect to allow fishermen to other areas. And then you're adding into the works right now these small-scale fisheries kelp permitting. They're harvesting kelp on the beaches now, not within the MPA, but with just outside the MPA. Now, we are also, the MPA is part of the Kogelberg Biosphere Reserve, and it's tiny, and within that is also a penguin colony. 2 nights ago, the census just showed that there's 100 pairs missing. They expected 100 pairs more. It's in serious decline. It's rapidly declining in front of our eyes, and yet right up to the fence of the penguin colony, there are kelp permitted harvesters allowed up there. There's penguins all over the place. They're totally disturbing it. It's a critically endangered species now. It's probably going to go extinct. And it's still a marine buffer zone, MPA buffer zone of the Kogelberg, marine buffer zone of the Kogelberg, and it needs further protection. I promote 2 things. One, that we fully restrict the MPA, as tiny as it is within Betty's Bay, and watch the spillover effect, but it does require enforcement. There is basically no angling enforcement. There's no checking permits. There's no this, that, and the other. And that we restrict kelp harvesting from the small-scale fishermen. I understand that they want to create jobs. There's no historic livelihoods at stake here. It has not been done by any of the small-scale fishery sector in our area before. But we cannot risk taking the kelp, which is basically, the beach kelp is the bridge between the oceanic system and the terrestrial system. And, you know, I've written some popular articles about this, and it's critically important throughout the year to all the kelp fly larvae and all the gamerids and stuff which go in to feed the small fish. When the waves lap over the larvae, they loosen the, or over the kelp stems, they loosen the larvae. And you can just see right in front of you all the small fry fish eating them. The bigger fish will take those, and then of course the bigger fish and also the penguins will take those. So we have to leave the kelp. But so we have to try and not have kelp harvesting even close to the MPA. And I propose that we make the MPA actually larger. In fact, I would love to see it taken out to Royals, but in the first instance, what we need to do is have a fully restricted MPA, non-extractive. I would promote the use of diving for touristic purposes and surfing and all that sort of stuff, obviously, but non-extractive at all. There's rock pool scraping every low tide. The rock pools are scraped to nothing with heavy metal tools. This is within the MPA. I watch it every single day. It's just, it's really tragic what is happening to it, and yet it's so tiny, and not even that can be protected apparently. Of course it can. We need a will. Okay, any comments, please, guys?
Hi, Pete. I'm glad you came in. And if my idea of conversation or the topic was not to give the idea that Betty's Bay is doing great. Let me start there. So what I was trying to talk to was more of the community involvement side of things, and that's what we're trying to do, and that's part of my work. But then just to comment on the things we've said, they are conversations from Cape Nature's side, and maybe you can follow up on this to look at rezoning. But then the other thing that we need to acknowledge is how the MPA was initially set up, and that's what the community tends to battle with, and that's why we're trying to, with the PAAC and with the Kochopek Marine Working Group, to look at how do we make sure we engage better with the community, especially with the process of like public participation, because that has not been the best previously. So with all of that happening, and if we're looking at rezoning, and you're not the only one who's talking about it's too small, but then we also need to quite catch that. Sorry. Could you please repeat it? Sorry. And then also the conversation needs to also look back on if we rezoning to this bigger size, and there's challenges. One, there's capacity, lack of capacity. Kendyl touched on funding and capacity, and if there's such things. So if we stop it, my phone is being rude. But then if we're looking at that, there's capacity at Stony Point problem. So if we're increasing the size, then we need to look at where do we get funding to support those that MPA, to say this is area, who's gonna monitor that? And with the monitoring, then again, you're still involving the community, because then that's how you make sure that is well managed. And then there's poaching. I mean, poaching in that area is ridiculous, to say the least. And I'm sure because you stay there, so you see it every day. So those are the kind of things. Yes, we can increase the area. I agree. Yes, we can look at protection or increasing, making sure it's a no-go area at all. But then we need to be very careful that it's not a matter of protect and then people are no longer benefiting. I'm thinking of the Moisa community. I'm sure you know it. There's small scale fishes there that are benefiting from the shore. So if we're doing that, what are the alternative livelihood? And that's part of the work that I'm doing with WWF, to look at what are the alternative livelihood or supplementary livelihoods for the small scale fishes. With regards to kelp, there is small scale fishers have been given rights. They are now into a co-op, so they were given at least a basket with different species. So they have West Coast rock lobster in there, they have Hottentot or just lionfish, and then kelp for the Claremont community and other communities like Baffeljaag and Gansbaai. They have kelp, so they are allowed to harvest in that coastal area. So from Gordons Bay, moving to Baffeljaag side. The challenges that you mentioned, we also noted them. And through the Kochopek Biosphere Marine Working Group, we've been trying to engage and trying to see how can we get this co-ops to at least start with how do you sustainably harvest and where do we harvest. We're also trying to engage with DFFE to say where can they harvest? Because you're right, by the MPA, there's dunes that we need to talk about. There's also your what do you call, the seabeds that are endangered that in that area. So how do we make sure that we protect and also teach the sustainable way of doing things? So there is a lot of work that is being done behind, and I acknowledge that I'm glad that the community is also aware, so that it makes it easier to have such conversations. Yeah, you're welcome to email me, and then we engage with other people. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Kolo, and thank you for your question, Pete. I am going to, okay. Would you like to add anything?
Just briefly, yeah, I understand that the rezoning is afoot. I mean, I talked to Steve and what have you, and I'm part of the pack, but it's been going on for years and years and years, this rezoning. I've seen the documents for, I think, 10 years at least. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. With regard to kelp, it's commonly, the argument is commonly that we should not harvest kelp within the oyster catcher nesting season. However, it is a very important resource both the terrestrial and then back into the marine environment, beach kelp drives the marine environment system by all these larval fish that come and feed off the kelp fly larvae, which do not feed on the kelp until it gets beached. So take that away, you remove one link in the chain, and you destroy that bridge between the marine and the coastal, and then back to the marine system. So it's very important that we, in my mind, from an ecological perspective, we do not harvest kelp anywhere close to an MPA, particularly when there's penguins all around and you're actively disturbing the penguins right there. You're shooing them out of the way to get your kelp. I mean, that's bad. That cannot be good. So yeah, I will engage with you, Kholo. Let's chat in Billy sometime soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, that's a great point that you made, Pete. Thank you. I think Maret will share contact details between Kholofelo and Pete. I'm now going to ask Peter. You had some questions in the chat, so if you're willing to ask it yourself.
Can you hear me there?
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you very much. I guess what I'd like to share is just a success story. I'm a member of the Carmel Ski Boat Club, and we have the Amatola MPA in our area. And the first point I'd like to make is that the public has a role in protecting MPAs. And I think, you know, whilst we're all looking at the regulators, we're looking at the government, whoever to do this work, we all as the public, you know, environmentally conscientious people need to do something about ourselves. So, you know, if we look at catches in the Amatola area, you know, up the Wild Coast and so on, and the effectiveness of our MPA, it's been really, really fantastic. I must tell you, I mean, I've been fishing this coastline for 40 years, as I said earlier on in my chat, and we've never seen fish stocks and quality of fish and size of fish like we're experiencing at the moment. So that's to Bruce's point. And you know, sometimes we always hear the negative about anything. I just wanted to share the positives about this. So it's doing very well, and I know Bruce is well aware of this all. So great work by all. But you know, we jealously protect this coastline of ours. You know, we have villages of Morgan Bay, Hugga Hugga, and Ganubi, you know, all the way to East London. And we even have a watch system where we alert people, you know, alert other people if we see a boat that's in the MPA. And you know, as of late, we even did a public arrest where a guy was fishing in the MPA, and by the time he reached Ganubi, the police and all the officials were waiting for him. He's had his boat confiscated, and so this is the way the message goes out, and that's not the only one. We've made many civil arrests in this regard. My point is we all have a role to play, and so we really treasure our MPA and we look after it very well. I think the second point I wanted to make is that it's obvious when you you know, part of an MPA like this, that there are things that are required, and you know, we spoke about the spawning season of fish, spawning season of spawning for red stem bass, for example. Our club closes, you know, the fishing completely for the fishermen along that period, over that period, sorry. And there's no fishing for red stem bass in the period from the 1st of October until the end of November, which is the red stem bass spawning season. The point I make is that these are the kind of initiatives that the department should be picking up and responding to and regulating that. Not, you know, and there are many. We should not catch any fish in a spawning period. And I think furthermore, the big issue here is estuarine fishing for cob. We all know the dusty cob is under threat. You know, various cob species are under threat, and yet we tolerate and allow fishing during spawning periods. So I'm not sure how this gets taken forward over time, and when the scientists will be, you know, kind of listened to in this regard, because I know it's been tabled on many occasions, but we don't tend to move the needle forward with respect to protecting fish during spawning periods. So that's the last point I'd like to leave you with. And I'm not sure if Bruce has got any information or you know, anybody else can comment on that. That's my point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. Yeah, it's good to hear positive stories, and I agree with you. Ultimately, it's only through people taking responsibility and getting involved. I mean, I was listening to Kholo's explanation for Betty's Bay, and it's the same thing. It's actually, it's going to be at the end of the day up to the local people who live in that area to kind of get motivated, and if everyone agrees that this is the best thing to do, let's have a higher level of protection. So I was sort of thinking back to the work in the early 90s, late 80s, that was done by Gary Russ and Angel Alcala in the Philippines, which is really where, through talking to fishermen communities, they implemented their own MPAs. They kind of put in no-take areas where they were the best areas to do it, and they protected them themselves, and they jealously guarded those areas, and they benefited from the spillover. They knew they worked, and we need to take a leaf out of those books and kind of sometimes get on with it, and the fishermen need to take kind of some responsibility for helping to protect it. And I really get excited when I see fishermen taking on that kind of responsibility and blowing the whistle and helping with law enforcement, because we just don't have the management capacity to do this with our law enforcement agency. So once the fishermen assist and we on the same page, then we're getting somewhere. So that's wonderful to hear. With regard to the fishing regulations, and in particular, you mentioned the cob. Yeah, the scientists have been trying for a long time. I sort of look at my head here and I see my grey hair, and I think it's from bashing my head against a brick wall for a long time, trying to get stronger regulations brought in. They are ready to go. So I'm just hoping that maybe our new environment minister is going to be a little bit more proactive at getting some of these important conservation regulations in place. But yeah, let's wait and see. But thanks for the comments.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the answer, Bruce. I'm just going to read a question from Kumo in the chat. She says, these MPAs, and I think this is directed at Bruce, these MPAs, do they have buffer areas, and how large is it? And how are those buffer areas regulated to promote conservation efforts intended by MPAs? Kendyl, I think you can answer as well.
Okay, I'll go first, Ken, if you like. Yes, indeed, and that's basically sort of talks to what Kendyl was showing in her presentation about how we have restricted areas and controlled areas. So what we try and do is close an area off as a no-take restricted area that is the best habitat, the best possible area that we can protect, and then the areas adjacent to that effectively function as buffer areas. So you would have seen on Kendall's first slide when she was showing you the zonation in Ismangaliso MPA. On the inshore zonation, we have no-take areas, and on either side of them, we have controlled areas, but they're controlled catch and release. So you can go and fish there, but you can't remove the fish. You've got to release them. So that way, the public, or the fishermen, recreational fishermen, can go and enjoy the area, experience wonderful fishing and wilderness, but they have to put the fish back. They can't bring the fish home. And then the next kind of zone down is a control, just a normal control zone, where you can fish with a normal recreational permit and you can harvest your bag limit of fish. So it's exactly like that. It's the same as the sort of terrestrial concept of having core wilderness areas and then buffer areas around it. So it's the same principle that we use in the design of our MPAs.
Thank you. Kendyl, do you want to add, or should I go into the next question?
I don't think I need to add to that. I think Bruce got it.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. I'm going to go to the next one, which is from Mike. What has been the impact of drone fishing on fish stocks from the shore? Using drones, bigger or better or mature breeding fish are caught. And even if they are released, these fish are exhausted and have less chance of full recovery. He also heard that there are some legislation enacted or maybe enacted to ban this practice. And he's a fisherman and he refuses to use a drone.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. It's not directly related to MPAs, but yeah, it's been a very controversial issue. Drone fishing certainly does have impacts. You can fish in areas with a drone that you can't fish using normal sort of rock and surf fishing tackle. You can sort of fly a bait out much further. Some of them have cameras. You can target reef areas. You can target fish, etc. So there was a lot of controversy about it. We did a study globally using social media and compared where drone fishing was being done around the world. It's mostly in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. We then looked at sort of impacts of drone fishing, and we really found in South Africa a lot of the fish that are targeted mostly by drones are your large sharks and rays, which are, most of them are pretty vulnerable to overfishing. By fishing with a drone, you've got a lot of braid normally out, so you're dropping your bait sort of 400 or 500 meters off the beach. If you get a cutoff or a break off, you get a lot of line left in the water. If you do land your fish after fighting it for a long time, bringing it in, they're normally exhausted. There's often what we call depredation. Your shark gets bitten by another shark in the process of fighting it. And so your chances of releasing those animals and ensuring their survival are much less than if you caught it with heavy tackle from the shore without casting out. So yeah, there were a whole lot of reasons. So we kind of basically asked whether this was legal, and we had a legal definition of the recreational fishing in the Marine Living Resources Act, defined by lawyers, and it was basically found that drone fishing wasn't recognized as a means of normal fishing. It was enhancing and making it kind of too easy, and it was having an impact. So based on that, the court decided that it was illegal, that the Department of Forestry and Fisheries and Environmental Affairs kind of put a stop to it. The drone industry was very upset. They had been making drones, building drones specifically adapted to using them for fishing. So they contested it. It went to the High Court. There've been, I think, 2 appeals, and now the matter has finally been settled that drone fishing is illegal in South Africa and won't be allowed. So that's the sort of nail in the coffin for that activity on the South African coast.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So thank you for sharing that also, Dr. Bruce. And then there is Penelope, who I don't know if any of us can answer this, but Penelope is saying in parts of the Western Cape, gangs are blatantly poaching and threatening the lives of anyone who attempts to stop or report them. And are there any suggestions that this kind of thing can be handled? So anyone want to touch on that?
Yeah, I'll pass on to you, Kolo, maybe. But look, I think it's a reality. It's mostly related to the abalone poaching, and these guys are armed. They're dangerous people, and it's often linked in with other forms of crime. The Chinese triads. There's drug trade. There's all sorts of other bad things going on associated with the abalone poaching. So certainly as a member of public, I wouldn't advise trying to kind of stand up to them on your own. But certainly if you see any of this type of activity going on in your area, the first thing to do is contact the the relevant authorities, whether it's the police or it's your nature conservation agency, because they are equipped to do something about it. But I think by being the eyes and the ears along the coast, the public can really play an important role at kind of putting a stop or making it really difficult for these gangs to operate.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Bruce. As a citizen or just a member of community, the advice there would be to not engage. But then as a community or as law authorities and everyone, it's also a conversation that's happening behind closed doors to say, how do we make sure we look at capacity, there's ranges, and how do we capacitate, how do we support the government as NGOs, and all those conversations that are happening. I like that Bruce says, be the ears and the eyes of your coastal community. So in Kohobek, last year we launched an app called Kohobek Care. I'll write it, I'll send the link in the group. It's still in the Kohobek and is in a pilot stage. And with that app, you're able to actually report different incidences, and poaching is one of them. And in that app, we're advising that, yes, as a community, you can take charge and report such incidences, but then do not engage. You're also safe because it's anonymous. No one will know you are the one who reported the incident. It has certain questions that you need to answer. If you see a car, you can give the number plate. And if you're able to take a picture, if not, don't. But then if you are able to take a picture, you can take a picture. And Bruce is quite right. It's a chain of, it's connected to other crimes and things. So it's a very delicate problem. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh, they're not answering me, because there's no definite answer into how do we solve this. It's just other things. It's us making sure that we empower the youngsters from a young age in understanding that there's other opportunities than being a poacher or being part of it. It's making sure that the youngsters are going to school and trying to be in conservation and trying to do better or study other things, in making sure that they're involved with extramural activities, so there's no chance for them to be to be included, or to be like, oh, I need that 3,000 in that day, and such activities. So it's from young, it's us making sure that we start with the young age, and then making sure that there's other opportunities to involve the youth, so that they don't feel left out, or they don't feel like there's nothing that they can do other than them being part of those poachers. So it's also just a social intervention that needs to happen on the ground from our side, and hopefully make sure that the communities eventually take charge, and then they're able to make sure that the poachers don't feel the power, if that makes sense. But then yeah, I'll send the link of what the app looks like so that you have an idea. Thanks.
Thank you, Kholo. Yeah, I also think my boss has the saying, ignite the spark, and you protect what you love. And so hopefully, maybe not completely, but at least have some impact in that. So because it's 27 minutes past 8, it's time for us to wrap up, unfortunately. So I want to again say thank you to each and every one of our speakers. It was brilliant. It was very informative. Learning all of this. Yeah, and there's still more comments and positive comments coming through. So I think what Maret will share all the comments that was written in the chat, and we will share it with all our speakers, and then hopefully just bridge the gap and allow for further communication after this. So yeah, once again, not Dr. Kendyl, Dr. Kendyl Wright Kholofelo, and Dr. Bruce, thank you very much for a very informative session. We really appreciate it.